Forget the number 100. This was not a single, unified conflict, but a dynastic struggle spanning 116 years, a cycle of devastating wars, uneasy truces, and renewed bloodshed that fundamentally shaped the modern nations of France and England. It began with a crown dispute, but quickly transformed into a clash over sovereignty, territory, and national identity. It was a war of unprecedented scale, where the old rules of chivalry were smashed by new technologies like the Welsh longbow. For more than a century, kingdoms clashed, crowns fell, and legends were born in the smoke of battle. This epic drama features kings captured in combat, peasants rising in revolt, and the miraculous intervention of a single, fearless young woman. This is the 100 Years' War, a story of power, pride, prophecy, and the painful birth of two great nations. The roots of the 100 Years' War run deep, extending centuries before the first arrow flew in 1337. The fundamental conflict was simple. English kings were also French nobles since the Norman conquest of 1066. English monarchs held vast tracts of French land, especially the rich region of Aquitaine. This made them vassals to the French crown, a relationship that was politically humiliating and militarily unsustainable. France sought complete sovereignty. England refused to relinquish its inherited wealth and ancient claims. The immediate trigger, however, lay in Paris, in 1328, the direct line of the Capetian dynasty, which had ruled France for over 3 centuries, abruptly died out with King Charles IV, leaving a dangerous vacuum. French law, specifically the interpretation of the ancient Salic law, was quickly asserted to prevent succession through the female line. The French throne passed to Charles's cousin, Philip VI of the Valois dynasty, but across the Channel, Edward III of England saw a golden opportunity and a legal loophole. Edward was the nephew of the late Charles IV, making his claim through his mother, Isabella of France, a direct Capetian heir. He argued, if his mother could not rule, why couldn't her son inherit the right? While the French court unanimously denied his claim, Edward initially submitted, paying homage to Philip VI for Aquitaine. But this honor was thin, and the economic rivalry over the lucrative Flanders trade was intense, creating friction at every border. In 1337, Philip VI seized Aquitaine, citing Edward's lack of proper obedience. This provided Edward III with the perfect legal justification. Defiantly, he rejected his vassal status, formally proclaimed himself the rightful king of France, and issued a direct challenge. The stage was set for a century of conflict, a direct result of ancient bloodlines and modern economic greed. With Edward III claiming the French throne, the initial phase of the war began with a series of devastating raids, known as chevauchées. These were not attempts to hold territory, but calculated campaigns of terror and plunder, designed to cripple the French economy and lure the King of France into a decisive battle. That confrontation finally came in 1346 at the Battle of Crécy. The French army, led by King Philip VI, was vast, confident, and heavily reliant on the chivalric ideal, the charge of the heavily armoured mounted knight. The English, however, introduced the true game-changer, the Welsh longbow at Crécy. The disorganised French forces faced a disciplined English line, protected by sharpened stakes. The French crossbowmen, outranged and disorganised, were swept aside. Then, the English archers unleashed a storm. Firing up to 12 arrows per minute, the longbow effectively annihilated the flower of French nobility, whose heavy armour became a liability in the mud. Crécy was a humiliating French defeat and established the longbow as the dominant weapon of the medieval battlefield. A year later, the English seized the vital port of Calais, securing a strategic gateway to the continent that would remain in English hands for over 2 centuries. The second great catastrophe for France struck 10 years later, in 1356, at the Battle of Poitiers. Led by Edward's son, Edward the Black Prince, the English repeated the Crécy tactics against the French forces led by King John II. The result was even more disastrous. The French King John II was actually captured in the battle, a catastrophic blow to French morale and its government's legitimacy. France was left without a functional monarchy, plunged into civil chaos, and ripe for the devastating economic and social collapse that was soon to follow. The military disasters at Crécy and Poitiers were only the beginning of France's torment. A far more devastating, invisible enemy was already sweeping across Europe. The Black Death, arriving in 1347, The plague paid no heed to national borders or social class. It halted armies, emptied cities, and fractured the medieval worldview. Historians estimate that the Black Death wiped out at least 1/3 of the population on both sides of the Channel, radically reshaping the social and economic landscape of the war. The catastrophe forced an uneasy, decade-long truce. The Treaty of Britannia, signed in 1360, temporarily ended the first phase of the war. Under this humiliating agreement, England gained full sovereignty over vast French territories, and the captured King John II was ransomed for an astronomical sum. However, the peace was superficial. In France, the political vacuum and the crushing taxes imposed to pay the royal ransom led to widespread social explosion. Frustrated by the nobility's failure to protect them, peasants across the countryside launched the bloody revolt known as the Jacquerie. In Paris, the urban populace rose up in parallel revolt, demanding political reforms. These uprisings revealed the deep class divide and the kingdom's profound instability. It was during this time of collapse, death, and social chaos that a profound shift in worldview occurred. The church offered little comfort. People turned to dark prophecies and fear of the apocalypse. The war transformed from a dynastic squabble into a perceived punishment from God. The stage was set for the second phase of the war, not merely between kings, but between two societies forever changed by plague and revolt. The humiliation and chaos of the early war forced France into a decade of painful recovery. Upon the death of John II, his son, Charles V the Wise, ascended the throne in 1364. Charles V was a pivotal figure. He was not a swashbuckling warrior like his predecessors, but a cautious intellectual and political strategist. He fundamentally rejected the French chivalric obsession with grand, decisive battles, recognizing that the longbow made them too risky. His approach was revolutionary: avoid pitched battles at all costs. Instead, he adopted a Fabian strategy, focusing on attrition warfare, small skirmishes, sieges, and systematically isolating English garrisons until they were forced to surrender. His military architect was the brilliant Constable, Bertrand du Guesclin. Du Guesclin masterfully reorganized the French army, successfully dealing with the devastating problem of the routiers, or mercenary free companies, by exporting the conflict to the Castilian Civil War in Spain. This simultaneously cleared France of criminals and weakened the English position. Meanwhile, Edward the Black Prince became mired in Spanish and Aquitanian politics. He taxed his subjects heavily to fund his foreign campaigns, quickly losing popular support, and suffered from a debilitating illness. By the 1370s, Charles V and du Guesclin had successfully pushed the English forces back, reclaiming nearly all the territory gained at Bretigny. It was a stunning recovery achieved without a single major victory. When Charles V died in 1380, the war entered another frustrating stalemate. Both kingdoms faced severe internal turmoil: Charles VI's tragic descent into madness in France, and the deposition of Richard II in England. This led to a long, unofficial truce that lasted for over 30 years, but the dynastic claim was never truly rescinded. The fuse for the next, most famous, and most brutal phase of the conflict was simply waiting to be relit. The peace of 3 decades was shattered in 1415 by the most famous warrior king of the English line, Henry V. Henry was determined to reclaim the full French crown and its lost territories. Viewing the French internal turmoil, particularly the devastating civil war between the Armagnac and Burgundian factions, as a sign of divine favour, he landed in Normandy and marched toward Calais, forcing a climactic battle. On October 25, 1415, the Feast of St. Crispin, Henry V's exhausted, outnumbered, and often sick English army met the massive, confident French host at Agincourt. The French command, blinded by the traditions of chivalry, repeated the errors of Crécy and Poitiers. They chose to charge their heavy cavalry across a freshly ploughed field, which had been turned into a thick, muddy swamp by days of rain. Once again, the English longbow proved absolutely decimating. The French charge stalled in the mud, creating a huddled, panicked mass that made a perfect target for the thousands of English arrows. The subsequent melee was a slaughter. Agincourt annihilated a generation of French nobility and cemented Henry V's status as a legend. The defeat plunged France into chaos. The Duke of Burgundy, John the Fearless, allied himself fully with the English. In 1420, Henry V forced the French queen, Isabella of Bavaria, to sign the humiliating Treaty of Troyes. This document effectively disinherited the French Dauphin, Charles, and recognized Henry V as the heir and regent of France. Henry then married the French princess, Catherine of Valois. The entire French kingdom was now legally his. The English King Henry V and the French Dauphin Charles were now rivals not just for a crown, but for the very soul of France. Following Agincourt and the Treaty of Troyes, France collapsed into two unequal halves. The northern capital, Paris, and the entire north were held by the English and their allies, the Burgundians. The true French Dauphin, Charles, was reduced to being the King of Bourgs, his court exiled to the Loire Valley, facing utter despair. The English victory was nearly complete. The final, critical piece of territory needed to solidify their control was the city of Orléans. If Orléans fell, the entire Loire Valley would open up, giving the English unfettered access to the Dauphin's last strongholds. The Siege of Orléans, beginning in 1428, became the defining struggle of the war. It was at this lowest ebb, when the Dauphin was contemplating flight to Spain or Scotland, that history took an abrupt, miraculous turn. In the small, remote village of Domremy, a peasant girl named Jeanne d'Arc began hearing voices. She claimed these were the voices of saints and angels, guiding her with a divine prophecy. She must lift the siege of Orléans and ensure the Dauphin's coronation. The idea was ridiculed, but her conviction was unshakable. Against all protocol, Jeanne secured an interview with the Dauphin Charles. He was skeptical, testing her with disguises and theological questions. But her sincerity, her detailed knowledge of the siege, and a promise only he understood, convinced him. Charles provided her with armor and a small retinue. Her arrival at the siege in 1429 immediately electrified the demoralized French troops. Jeanne brought not military expertise, but an unshakable faith and the conviction that God was finally on the French side. Within days, under her inspiration, the French successfully broke the English siege. The miracle of Orléans marked the most profound turning point of the entire war. The tide had definitively turned, not by a king or a constable, but by a simple farm girl. With the siege of Orléans broken, Jeanne d'Arc's next, crucial task was the coronation of Charles VII. Though the city of Reims was deep within Burgundian territory, Jeanne marched the Dauphin there. His formal coronation in 1429 transformed Charles from a deposed prince into God-anointed king. Sadly, Jeanne's own story ended tragically. Captured by the Burgundians and sold to the English, she was tried for heresy by a corrupt church court and burned at the stake in 1431. Yet, her martyrdom galvanized French national sentiment far more powerfully than any victory. The remaining 2 decades of the conflict became a slow, inevitable French victory. Charles VII, now fully legitimate, reorganized the state, created France's first standing army, and modernized its finances. In 1435, the English lost their crucial ally when the Duke of Burgundy abandoned them and signed the Treaty of Arras with Charles VII. This single act doomed the English cause. The French slowly retook Paris, then Normandy, and finally Aquitaine. The last battle of the war is considered the Battle of Castellon in 1453. In a final, symbolic reversal, the English lost not to the longbow, but to the French use of modern artillery. By 1453, the only English territory remaining in France was the port of Calais. The 100 Years' War defined the future of both nations. For England, the defeat led to the internal War of the Roses and a new focus on becoming a dominant sea power. For France, the war catalyzed a shared sense of national purpose, unified the country under a strong monarchy, and solidified the identity we recognize today. The conflict began as a medieval dynastic feud and ended with the painful birth of 2 powerful, modern nation-states.